meeting. That worked. And we'll post it on our website later. So you'll be able to find it there later. Yeah, if you have any questions after Margaret's talk, you can also raise your hand and I will see that in the participant list and I'll try to get to you too. If you are dialing in on a phone, you can mute your phone with *6 and unmute it with *6. And if you want to raise your hand on your phone, you can do that with *9. That works. I'm Annika. I'm a second-year PhD student at the Geophysical Institute in Fairbanks. I study snow, snow reflectivity and snow melt, and the thermal properties of snow. And I'm very excited to learn with you in this lecture series for the next couple weeks. Before I introduce Margaret, I want to thank GIGSA, the Geophysical Institute Student Association, for helping us host the lecture series. And I want to acknowledge that despite all of us being online in front of our computers, Margaret and I are students at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, which is built on Trathgyada, on a hill that has been built on the unceded lands of the lower Tanana Dene. And Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous cultures is an integral part of our university, and it would be great to see that strengthened, especially in the West Ridge of UAF. With that, I'd like to introduce Margaret to you, who's also our co-host, but she's our first speaker today. So I have the honor and pleasure to introduce her to you. Margaret has a bachelor's and a master's from UAF in civil and Arctic engineering, and she transitioned into the Arctic and Northern Studies program for her PhD. And she's studying the co-production of knowledge and how to respectfully engage with Indigenous people in research. But because she's going to tell you a lot more about this right now, I'm going to keep it short and hand it over to Margaret. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Annika. So yeah, today I'm doing introduction both to lecture series as well as to cross-cultural miscommunication. So kind of an overview, I'll kind of introduce what we're planning to do with TEK Talks, as well as some terminology. Since this is the first lecture, I figured it'd be good to kind of give an overview on some of the basic concepts for people that may have not heard this before. And then I'll talk about worldview, like Indigenous worldview versus scientists. And then I'll talk about communication, and then my research is on boundary spanners, and then some questions. So kind of about TEK Talks. Let me bring up my notes. I lost them. So what we have is so the GIGSA is Geophysical Institute Graduate Student Association. And this past summer, the president and vice president held discussions on diversity, equity, inclusion. And from that, we kind of developed a plan, specific actions. And from that was TEK Talks. We were interested not only in looking at improving DEI stuff within the GI, but also how we go out and do research. And so the TEK Talks are kind of made for geoscientists in mind, in the sense of thinking about what kind of research and activities geoscientists would participate in with Indigenous people, but it's certainly open to all. We're hoping definitely it'll be applicable to other sciences. We just wanted to specify geosciences because like healthcare and research around health is like a whole nother level of complexity that we are not going into. And then with our way we're talking about scientists is that it could probably feel like Indigenous people can't be scientists, but that's definitely not true because, you know, I am definitely Indigenous and a scientist. And I also wanted to make sure that we kind of are thinking along the lines that this is really just start of a conversation. It's very complex issue. And, you know, mine's just the first TEK Talk, as well as a lot of, I think, the discussions we'll be having are introductions to just ideas and concepts that could go further. And I wanted to thank everyone that submitted questions. I try to include several into my talk, and if I didn't get to your question, most likely it's going to be asked by a future speaker. But certainly, if you have more questions, just put them in the chat. And I also, since this is kind of a starter discussion, I have a lot of resources I'll share with you throughout the thing in the chat, but I also will update the website later today that'll have all the resource links as well. And so a little bit more about me. So my Inuit name is Anamuk, after my great aunt. My mother's Rose. Her parents are Peter and Teresa Mayak, originally from King Island. And my father is Stephen Sysaski. And I grew up here in Fairbanks and in Anchorage. And that is probably a shortened version of my traditional introduction. If you haven't kind of heard that before, it's pretty common in Indigenous cultures to introduce yourself that way. And that's because the Indigenous worldview is based on relationships. It's very relational, but also kind of to give you kind of an more understanding of that, I also kind of define my academic relationships. So my PhD advisor is Alex Hirsch. I am out of the Arctic Northern Studies program. It's interdisciplinary, also including a lot from Indigenous studies. I got my master's under Yuri Scher. I worked for several years at CREL, the Cold Regions Research and Engineering Laboratory, where I did most of my work related to the permafrost tunnel. That's where the photo's from. As well as I worked for the Geophysical Institute for several years doing informal education, traveling to rural Alaskan villages to talk about permafrost and climate change under Matthew Stern. And I kind of define that because if you never met me before, but if you've heard of these things, if you are a geoscientist or associated with the university, you probably know these people. And I think that kind of helps you put me into context of who I am. And so I kind of want to express that. It's kind of the same thing with traditional, but you're doing it more for people and Indigenous people. So next is terminology. And kind of the first one I wanted to go over is traditional knowledge and Indigenous knowledge. I think there's a lot, it's kind of confusing because I feel like a lot of times they're interchangeable, but it kind of really is all over the place. It's a very debatable definition when you start really getting to the literature. Traditional knowledge can sometimes be, oh, sorry. And also being reminded by my funder, I also am being funded by Sarah Trainer, and I'm associated with ACAP through IARC. I forgot to put that in there. So yeah, because traditional can be viewed as old. And so that's why a lot of people might prefer Indigenous knowledge. But also I've read some literature that says they like the word traditional because it's traditions and thinking about the cultural way of life. And that kind of then goes to this idea of like, what exactly is knowledge? And for them, both, either whether you're talking about traditional knowledge or Indigenous knowledge, it's really a way of life. And so it's quite different the way maybe more of the dominant culture thinks about what knowledge is. And I guess for me, I usually use Indigenous knowledge because it's more formal and I kind of prefer it. But then I know working with a lot of Alaska Natives, they might prefer traditional knowledge because of the formality feels a little bit cold. But let's go into actual definition. So I picked one definition from the Inuit Circumpolar Conference. Indigenous knowledge is a systematic way of thinking applied to a phenomena across biological, physical, cultural, and spiritual systems. It includes insights based on evidence acquired through direct and long-term experiences and extensive and multi-generational observations, lessons, and skills, has developed over millennia and is still developing in a living process, including knowledge acquired today and in the future as it's passed from generation to generation. And so that's kind of the multi-generational aspect is also one fundamental thing about traditional knowledge. And I guess thinking about this definition, just to add to show you the complexity, is that QUARC also has their own definition for indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge, and they are a Nupiat region around Nome, which is also Inuit. And so that's kind of like the level of complexity that we were talking about. And so for me, if I was planning on working with a community, I feel very uncomfortable applying outside definitions to a group of people's, their own knowledge system. And one example that I quite like and reference a lot is out of Nunavut. They actually named their own what they call traditional knowledge. They call it Inuit Qaujimajatuqangit, or IQ for short. Let me put some links in the chat for you too. So this one's from the ICC. And if you want to learn more about this Nunavut, there is this recent paper that talks about the IQ as well as what they call Sci-IQ, which is about their kind of way of seeing how science and IQ work together. It's a very interesting paper written by youth in Nunavut. And so that's kind of, yeah. So for me, definitely, I would refer to your community partners on what they want it to be called instead of having outside definitions. Another aspect is local knowledge. And it's kind of slightly different in the sense that if you're talking about indigenous or traditional knowledge, that knowledge is cultural, it's communal, and it's also can be sacred, versus local knowledge could be just based on the individual's local knowledge. It's just a little bit different. And again, this is something probably defined by your community partners, but definitely something to think about is if it is communal and sacred, is intellectual property rights. Do you have the right to share that knowledge outside of that community, outside of the relationships you have with that partnership? And that is a whole nother giant conversation and like lecture and really lecture series that we aren't probably going to cover here, but it's definitely something to be aware of. And then that gets us to traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK. And so this is very much a science term. Within the Indigenous worldview, this does not exist. And that's because the Indigenous worldview is holistic in the sense that they don't see the ecological part separate from the cultural part. And so, and that's kind of like science is separate. Like science is like a thing that you study separate from like other things, versus again, traditional knowledge is really like a way of life. It's holistic, it's all encompassing. And again, it goes to the different concepts of what exactly is knowledge. And so if this is a science term, why did we, if this is not a term Indigenous people use, why do we name it? It's because it's a science term. It's something we figured would be relatable to scientists, the audience we're hoping to attract, as well as it sounds cool. TEK Talks, so sort of like TED Talks, but with a K. And then we figured if we tried to name it something more indigenous, scientists would assume that we're talking about more cultural, anthropological type research and not about science. And so kind of thinking more about science and indigenous knowledge, there is this, let me put it in the chat for you where the article is, where it comes from. And so this Venn diagram comes out of literature from Ray Barnhart and Oscar Quagli, probably two of the foundational leaders for Indigenous education. in Alaska. And so if you haven't heard of them, they're really great to read. And so I think this actually came from Sydney Stevenson's, though. But this kind of goes in a little bit, and so we can kind of dissect it a little bit. So the first thing when you're looking at this Venn diagram is holistic and Indigenous knowledge, holistic versus Western science, parts of a whole. And I think what they're alluding to is more that it's discipline based, that we usually become highly specialized in one thing and we're part of the cog of science, is my guess. Otherwise, I mean, I figured science as a whole, I think many scientists would agree that it is whole, not part. And then Indigenous knowledge includes physical, metaphysical, world links to moral code, and emphasis on practical application and skills and knowledge. And so I think this goes more into the differences in worldview. And again, the sense that the culture aspect is not separate from the science aspect. And then compared to Western science, limited to evidence, explanation within the physical world, emphasis on understanding how. And so I think what they're alluding to there is intuition. And I'll go into that a little bit more later. Trust, and then Indigenous knowledge is trust in inherent wisdom and respect for all things. And that goes a little bit more into the values aspect of the culture versus Western science is skepticism. And so that can kind of get a little tricky if you are questioning things that are cultural. It can be quite offensive. Some things I like for both the common ground and habits of the mind: honesty, inquisitiveness, perseverance, and open-mindedness. And then you kind of go into more of these skills and procedures. Indigenous knowledge is practical experimentation, oral record, local verification. So they do kind of have their own peer review type process. It's local and it's through talking and not written. And communication of metaphor, story, and connected to life value and proper behavior. And so again, if you've heard too, it's very story-based, again, oral traditions, stories, versus more Western science, it's very written. We have our own peer review process where it's usually more global. Let's see, some other things I wanted to highlight. Integrated and applied to daily living and traditional subsistence practice, because again, it's a way of life and not so much of a separate thing that you do to study it. And I guess in general, when I read Ray Barnhart and Oscar Quaggley before, I always felt like it is about science education, not necessarily about science itself, but I always felt like some of the concepts for science were overgeneralized and kind of missed some things. And I don't know if there's any scientist that looks at this chart and might think the same thing. And I think that's just the function of trying to do this versus thing, is that you do overgeneralize, you start to tokenize ideas, and then it leads to misconceptions. And I feel like I'm 100% sure Indigenous people will read this and maybe think the same thing about Indigenous knowledge, as well as when we are there looking at literature about Indigenous people, they probably also read that with the same ideas of like, that's not quite right. And so I think a better way to think about the differences is through the worldview. So worldview, again, is just kind of how it says, like how you view the world. Kind of the bigger words around it is ontology and epistemology, which is basically the ways of being, knowing, and thinking. I kind of debated how much detail I want to get into this. I could argue, if you are into that, like positivism versus constructivism, or maybe talk about animism, but I felt like that was getting a little too boring. And so I figured I want to just more highlight some of the aspects of Indigenous world that you might not be aware of. And so again, going to this overgeneralization is, again, thinking about this is that the stuff I'm going to share is probably like, again, more stories, because when I was trying to look into this and really kind of decipher what it means to have differences in the ways of knowing and ways of thinking, is that when I often read when there are verses from non-Indigenous people, I felt like, again, it was overgeneralization, full of misconceptions of what it actually is. And I feel like if you really want to understand the differences in the worldview, it's very contextual. It's going to take a long time for you to understand, and it's going to be something that is like pretty heavily studied. One good book that I think provides a really good introduction to it is Braiding Sweetgrass from Robin Wall Kimmerer. It's also just a lovely book to read. She's Indigenous, she studies ecology. Yes, it's a great book. And so again, the difference when you think about Indigenous knowledge, it is very much the way of life. It is experiential knowledge, lived experiences is foundational for it. And kind of the way I think about it is also relationships, going back to that idea. And I put the picture of the permafrost tunnel in here because when I worked at Corel, being kind of like the low man on the totem pole, I'd spent a lot of time in the tunnel. Basically, if someone had to do research in the tunnel that wasn't a Corel employee, I'd go with them and make sure that they're doing things safely and stuff like that. So I spent just a lot of free time in the tunnel. That gave me a lot of time just to explore and to be curious. And it really was just every time going, and he's still going and seeing new things, seeing different things, because it's just like, it's like getting to know a person. So it is very much like a relationship. Like you just discover new things all the time. And as well as with the relationship too, is that you start noticing subtle changes that would happen. Like there would be a slab of the ceiling that would fall down a little bit because of sublimation, the drying out of the tunnel basically. And you just start noticing those little changes over time. And I don't think you could measure that it'd be hard to even measure that through science and just spending that time. And I felt like it was this iterative process of reading papers and then going to the tunnel and seeing it. And so I feel like the tunnel was definitely how I can relate to what Indigenous knowledge would be like for someone that has that deep connection to the land, because I did not grow up doing the subsistence way of life. As well as thinking about the relationship to the land, that's why land acknowledgements are so important, because as well as Indigenous land rights, because their ways of knowing, epistemology, worldview, developed from their relationship with their ancestral lands. And that's why we do it. As well as because, you know, American history is not taught in schools, and like Indigenous history. And another aspect is intuition. And one author I really like that kind of is a non-Indigenous author, he's Canadian, he's a lawyer, is Rupert Ross, and he wrote Dancing with a Ghost. And he tried to, you know, again, similar with me, kind of thinking about what is Indigenous knowledge, what is this intuition they have that they could just pull things out and be like, I feel like it's this way, and be right. And it has to do with this very, again, intentional observation, similar to what I did in the tunnel. And over time, you just kind of start building it into your subconscious, this knowledge. And it becomes so complex that it's hard for you to describe. Another author that I feel like also talks about it in a very much different way is Shankar Vedantam. So The Hidden Brain, which is an NPR radio show, there's actually also a book that came before the show that's amazing too. And he talks about how we build things like intuition And it's just through this thing where when you first start learning something new, so think if you are a grad student or if you were previously a grad student, like the first couple of years feels like you're super slow learning. And that's normal because you're building like this foundational knowledge. And then you start grouping it in your subconscious together. And then as you learn more and more, that then just starts making associations and building until you kind of almost do have an intuition. And I feel like Indigenous people value that intuition a lot more than non-Indigenous people. And I don't want to say it doesn't exist with non-Indigenous people, because if you are kind of a believer like the Myers-Briggs, some people are more intuitive than others. But again, it's just like within science, we're very linear. Like if you say something, you need to prove it very linearly, versus in Indigenous culture, that's not the case. They trust that you have good intuition, that you really thought about it deeply within yourself. And then I feel like another thing that comes up, another big word, is axiology. And this goes to values. And so the values that a culture has. And so I did put the Inupiat values up on the screen here. And I feel like this is also fundamental, like why there can be conflict between research methods as well as like policy. Oh yeah, Blink is also a good one for non-Indigenous intuition. And so I put the link to the paper on the Inupiat values. And I think this is where I mentioned animism. And that's where this idea of humans being superior than non-humans, so animals, plants, earth, things like that. And so, you know, that is very much like a Christian worldview ideas that I think still exists even if you're not Christian, if you're raised in more of the Western culture that you're not aware of, versus Indigenous culture, you're very much part of the same level. You're part of this ecosystem, so you're not separate, you're in it. And so then this comes up, this idea of objective versus subjective, in the sense that scientists have an assumed objectiveness that sometimes maybe that they need to check a little bit more, versus Indigenous people, they understand they're subjective, but then they kind of, what I've heard, which I really liked more from like Oscar Quagley's work, is that if you assume you're subjective, then you can check that and then try to be objective. And another thing to kind of think about axiology and values is that quite often when your geoscientists are going to work with Indigenous people, it's going to be about their lives. It's going to be about climate change. It's going to be about their food systems, their living situations. You know, it is their lives. And so that's where it's conflict, because one is work and one is your livelihood. And then next is thinking about methodology. There is a lot of literature on Indigenous methodology. Let me put my favorite is Margaret Rudolf, Indigenous methodologies. There's definitely other authors out there. And it goes to this idea that, you know, Indigenous culture is a very much established culture. And they have their own ways of building knowledge. They have their own ways of doing research that is not science and that is equivalent to science and should be respected. Another one to think about is critical methodology. And so this is when you take a critical look at Western or dominant culture or existing science methodology with a critical eye of like, you know, is this equitable? Is this inclusive to the Indigenous worldview? Things like that. Another way that it's usually called is decolonizing methodology. And then the most famous one is by Linda Smith. And then the last one, which is kind of what I'm studying, which is very much a growing field, is co-production of knowledge. And for Alaska, the biggest authors, or the biggest people that have been talking about it, has been Rachel Daniel, Carolina Behe, and Julie Raymond Yakubian. And so I put a link to the QUARC website, and that includes a video. I know they are working on a paper that should be out soonish. But definitely is the framework I'm using, the framework I'm building off of, as well as co-production knowledge is also like a lower 48 policy science field, but it's the idea of how do we indigenize it, how do we make it applicable to Arctic is kind of where I'm expanding. Same thing with those authors. So kind of going back then, if you're thinking about the differences in worldview, how is Indigenous and science compare and differ? Again, I don't necessarily like to pit them against each other because I feel like there's a lot of similarities as well as there are some differences that can be really hard to describe. And I feel like I like to make sure, I like the way to describe it is that Indigenous knowledge is equivalent to science in Indigenous culture. They're not necessarily the same. I like to think of it, if we're talking about how to talk about them, probably the analogy to think about is like apples and oranges. And when you're thinking about like knowledge integration, which is another way of thinking about how do you do co-production knowledge, is that I find integrate kind of a weird word, because can you integrate apples and oranges together and make a or apple? Like, not really. And same thing, you can't turn oranges into apples and vice versa. And so I like to use that analogy because I feel like there's a lot of, through misconceptions, there's a lot of research that has been where scientists are trying to turn Indigenous knowledge into science and push it into the science framework, and it just doesn't work because, again, it's a whole nother knowledge system, and science can't really encompass Indigenous knowledge and vice versa. They're separate. And so the way I like to think about doing co-production of knowledge is really, again, another kind of big fancy word is phenomenology. And when I started learning about this a couple months ago, I'm like, oh, that makes so much just sense. And not so much the philosophy, but the methodology of how you apply phenomenology. And that is because you respect the individual that's coming, that individual has their own unique perspective based on their culture background, their educational background, and just their experiences. And so I feel like quite often we talk about these things, even in this talk, is like, what's Indigenous versus science, is that we end up very much tokenizing it. And then we end up tokenizing people involved and make them into very much one-dimensional people. And I feel like I see that so often. And I think those people that experience it get a little frustrated. And kind of in a way for the geoscientists, it's thinking about, so our next speaker next week is Andy Mahoney, who studies sea ice. And can Andy Mahoney be interchangeable completely with like Hayo Aiken, also a sea ice scientist? Like maybe in some cases, yes, like they both have basic knowledge, but I feel like they're also have their own specialties. And I feel like you have to apply that same idea to Indigenous people. There are Indigenous people that are going to have skills in different things, knowledge in different things, passion in different things. And I just always remember that we're all individuals coming together. And I like to think too, since, my background's engineering, and so I'm really bad at trying to turn everything into problems that I can solve, because that's just what engineers do. And I just see where co-production knowledge and doing this together is like looking at problems side by side together in collaboration in ways that respect both worldviews, is kind of how I see this work being done. And so now this kind of goes into communication. And so we kind of talked about worldviews. And so I definitely think that in itself leads to miscommunication, but there's also behaviors and communication styles to think about. And again, this is Rupert Ross. I'll put the link again, oops, in the chat. And I really like this book because, again, it's not written by an Indigenous author, but I feel like it's a good introduction to the Indigenous worldview. And it's not for Alaska Natives, he's Canadian. But I think it's, when I read it, it was definitely, I could relate to a lot of things. And it's definitely there's probably a lot more nuances and stuff like that than what I'm going to present here when you're actually going to work with Indigenous people. But he had this list, and he goes way more in depth than I am here in his thing. So he talks about the ethic of non-interference. And so in general, Indigenous people will will find it rude and they won't do it themselves. Like, so if you go into the community, you have an established research method, they'll have the faith that you put a lot of thought into it and that you are going to do it a certain way. And so it's kind of rude for them to go and they're like, no, you shouldn't do it that way. You should do it this way. And so, and then the next ethic is anger not to be shown. So again, in general, Indigenous people are not confrontational. And so if you offend them, or if like they don't agree with what you're doing, they just won't participate in what you're doing. And so if you've had the experience where you want to do research and they're not really wanting to participate with you, it's most likely these two things. As well as the next one is ethic of respecting praise and gratitude. In general, praise and gratitude is not heavily given. And so if they feel like you're doing it right, they'll participate with you and they'll ask you to continue. And that means they like you and they like what you're doing. Again, it's not necessarily upfront and blunt. And then the next one is conservation withdrawal tactic. So Indigenous people, you might have heard, are like slow to talk. It's because they are very intentional and thoughtful before they speak, before they act, before they do things. And it's going to take a long time to develop a good relationship because of that. And then the last one's notion that the time must be right. And so again, if you're thinking about the conflict, is that quite often we'll have a funding solicitation come out. You have like 3 months to do it. You got to get it done. It's really fast, versus Indigenous people are like, you know, we're busy. We're like out doing the citizens' way of life in the summertime. They're not going to communicate with you on those calendar maybe terms. It also goes to, again, if you're conflicting with like policy, is that, you know, if you have very defined dates and when you're going to go hunting, that doesn't necessarily mean you're adapting to when the animals are there. And so traditionally you'd go hunting when the animals are there. It's very much, yeah, it's different. Another thing that comes up I see quite often is this idea of consensus. And so this kind of goes to, if you've heard about like Indigenous talking circles, is because then everyone can have a voice. You go in a circle, you talk, and you're kind of building consensus. They don't do debating, like academic debating. So that's also another conflict, I feel like. And again, then you have to kind of leave time for them to think, because again, thoughtful, intentional. And then where I've really started getting interested in this idea is thinking about inclusive facilitation. Because I feel like there are ways to moderate, if you have scientists and Indigenous people together, to make sure you're leaving the space for the Indigenous people to communicate with the ways they want to and the style they want to. Well, I don't know. Sometimes I just feel like it's better. Like academic debating is kind of fun sometimes, but I feel like in a huge group setting where you're trying to all work together, consensus is a much better approach. The next one is language. So this is huge because, again, language really represents the worldview, especially if there are those out there who are other language speakers. Some things just don't translate. And that's especially true for Indigenous languages. And there's also, you have to consider non-verbal is different. So like raised eyebrows is like, yes. Is just like one example, but they definitely have different nonverbal communication styles. And that kind of goes to where does miscommunication happen? And I feel like, you know, I bring up stereotypes and assumptions because I feel like, again, this is kind of the failure of the education system to really teach about Indigenous people and the true history of the United States. And the ideas you have about Indigenous people are probably stereotypes and can be negative stereotypes and not the way Indigenous people want to think about themselves. You can have a lot of misconceptions you're not aware of. And one misconception too is just like, again, tokenizing what it means to be an Indigenous person, and when Indigenous people are they themselves are very diverse. And when you have these stereotypes, and then you go into work in a village, you're going to make assumptions, and that's where it can get you in trouble, because that's when you can accidentally be offensive when you don't mean to. And assumptions, thinking about what kind of things that I see scientists do, is thinking about making assumption of what Indigenous people want, what roles they want to fill, how they want to participate in your research project, assuming they even want to participate in that research project. Assuming that they're going to volunteer their time is a huge one, because quite often science is seen as a function of doing broader impacts, doing good, but that's again debatable on on whose idea is that. And yeah, and I think the biggest thing you can do for miscommunication, again, is a lot of self-learning about Indigenous people, as well as reach out very early in the research process. And then another one to think about is being fully human. Because again, a lot of these research projects, if a lot of people are interested because they're talking about the livelihoods of Indigenous people, the infrastructure, the food systems, their adaptation to climate change, their resilience, their sustainability, all these things that are very much personal to the Indigenous people you're going to work with. And if you are very objectively cold, it's awkward. That doesn't mean, you should still be professional. And that's what I mean by fully human. I also like to think that, scientists in general are kind of a bit socially awkward. And we have Alan Alda really trying to teach scientists to do improv so they stop talking at people and with people. And so I usually like to think that when I hear Indigenous people get frustrated with scientists, that's kind of where we're at, is communication is really not appreciated within the sciences. And reciprocity is a big aspect for being fully human, is making sure that you are listening. If you want to be heard, you need to make sure you're also listening, as well as also sharing similar aspects of your life. It's just, being fully human. And so that kind of, when you're thinking about miscommunications, that's kind of where I started really getting interested with my research, which is on boundary spanners. So boundary spanners are people that have epistemological agility, is like the fancy word. Basically, they're bridging the gap between the Indigenous worldview and the science worldview, as well as also maybe the physical gap between Indigenous communities in rural Alaska, as well as universities. And the boundary spanner, again, comes from Lower 48. So I'm really interested in looking at how to define that for Alaska and what does it mean for Indigenous people and co-production knowledge. So again, one thing thinking about people is this idea of seeing two-eyed. And so it's another link. And so this comes from Canadian literature, and it says seeing two-eyed is to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous ways of knowing, and to see the other eye with the strengths of Western ways of knowing, and using both of these eyes together. Because I feel like it's inherent with, it's people that are going to make this work, they're going to be able to see the both worldviews in order to realize when there's conflict happening, when they realize when there's miscommunication happening, really making it work. And when I'm thinking more about boundary spanners, of like who they are, is that there are many different people. It's not really a job title. There's no like job boundary spanner. It's more like one of the many hats someone wears. And quite often these people that fulfill the role of a boundary spanner are like social scientists or culturally sensitive scientists, more on the university end, and more on the community end. You have like tribal administratives, science literate leaders, people that are really interested in just working with scientists in general that are Indigenous living in the community. You can also have many people in between, like science liaisons or tribal/community liaisons, as well as like people like me, like Indigenous scientists. And there's a whole group of these people that have been boundary spanners. And that's where I feel like this is not really something that's, again, communication's not really valued. And I feel like this is a key to make it all work. And I wanted, again, this is my research, my PhD research, but I haven't done yet. And so I'm hoping to bring people together and really define these roles, really define what they do. But one thing I wanted to mention today is that I think these people are not staff. They're not outreach staff. They're not staff you just hire to deal with making a project work. These are people that are going to be your research project leaders, because these people need to be the leaders in order to understand how to design the research project that's going to be accommodating to both the worldviews. And generally, you're going to need more than one of them. And so questions. And so again, thanks for all of your questions. I'm going to answer a few of them now. So first one, I got several questions on COVID-19. How do we reach out to communities from COVID-19? And one major thing to think about, COVID is really high right now. And these tribes and local governments are dealing with that and the many different aspects around people being sick, also getting supplies, travel. They have a lot on their plate, and your research project probably is pretty low. And so you kind of have to be kind of aware of that. Another issue when working with, again, rural Alaska is connectivity issues. They don't have good internet. It's a real big issue. And so again, most of it might be phone calls, emails, just depending on, again, on the person. Some people prefer phone calls and emails just like anyone else. And it's just a lot of patience and a lot of time is the only thing I have for you. I don't have like a magic way to reach out to communities today. It is what it is. Another question I had, how do you avoid miscommunication? Well, the best way to do it is to learn about Indigenous culture and the worldview. The Alaska Native Knowledge Network, it's an older website, but it's still really good. Introduction to kind of the different cultures around Alaska. Read Indigenous authors. There is a good list, again, on ANCAN for Alaska Native authors, as well as, like I said, it takes time to really understand the Indigenous worldview. And so there's some respected anthropologists I'd recommend for you to start learning about. It was like Richard K. Nelson, Amy Ann Philip Reardon, Julie Cruikshanks will cover most of Alaska for you. Podcasts are also a fun way to learn more. Coffee and Quack is Alaska-based. All my relations lawyer 48, both I love. And courses, if you are a graduate student wanting to do this work, I seriously think you should take courses through Center for Cross-Cultural Studies and the Indigenous Studies program. They have a class next spring. Usually, I didn't look at the schedule, on traditional ecological knowledge, again, made for scientists, a whole entire course. Also, too, if you're thinking about building relationships, I would think about going to conferences that are attended both by scientists and Indigenous people. There's 3 of them. Copy the links into here. There is AtChem, and then Alaska Tribal Conference on Environmental Management, the Alaska Marine Science Symposium, and Alaska Forum on the Environment. All 3 are coming up in the next 3 months. I wish they were in person, but it is what it is. And one thing that Adelaide, which I see keeps posting in the chat, she likes to say, you have to go slow in order to go fast. And that's because you have to develop trust. And so really, when you start a project, you really have to start with grounding, and you really have to set the right purpose and intention in order to develop a common understanding of what the project is about before you start going into the details and the methods. If you try to do the details and methods first without reaching out to those communities, most likely it's a little offensive because you didn't think about the Indigenous world, but you didn't think about the wants and wishes of that Indigenous community. And this is where your community research partner in the co-production of knowledge like framework and boundary spanners comes in, is that those should be equal leadership partners to the scientists. And Quinakpak, thank you. Our next talk next Monday is with Andy Mahoney, CI scientist. And here is a link to the RSVP. And then any other questions? Going a little longer than I meant.
Great. We have one question from Elizabeth, I think. Thanks a lot. And Elizabeth asks, what are similarities and differences between Indigenous intuition versus the kind of intuition needed by Western scientists? Generally, intuition comes before any kind of formalized proof.
Any kind of formalized
proof?
Oh yeah, because I feel like the same thing is that, you know, my science hat on, I feel like I'm very intuitive because I ask questions, and then you kind of backtrack and you start thinking about how to linearly get there. And I do this quite often in my writing, is like, I feel like it should be this way, and then I kind of backtrack and figure out where I learned those things from that I combined in my subconscious, like which authors. And that's kind of how I've been doing my literature review. Versus I feel like Indigenous intuition, I don't know, that's a hard question, but I feel like, you know, you don't have to do that. And I quite often will, if I'm talking to younger students who are Indigenous, is like, totally own your intuition. Like, it's right, it's real. Don't let people think that your intuition's wrong. It's not.
We have time for another one. Kelly May asked, I'm very happy to see this co-production of knowledge section. I shared my current research with 2 faculty at UF without claiming my intellectual property. Oops. And now they are creating a PhD program around this exact thing, which is integrating neurotechnology into education. How would I go about making sure UF is inclusive with Indigenous knowledge and work? I am an Indigenous psychology student.
Oh, interesting. That is a really hard question. And I think that is, I agree. I feel like UAF might be a little bit better than maybe some other colleges, but I feel like it does need a lot more work to understand and make it more inclusive environment, especially in the sciences for Indigenous people. I think it's a big problem, and I am a little bit more hopeful with some of the activities going around right now around DEI issues. Yeah, that's almost like a whole nother lecture, thinking about how do we make academia more inclusive.
Question from Cuba Gresta. I hope I said this right. He says, thank you, Margaret. Are current funding mechanisms for Arctic research structured to include proper amounts of Indigenous participation and leadership?
Do they? No. Short answer. Again, I think there needs to be a lot of self-education by funders. Navigating the Arctic, I'll post this on our website. Navigating the Arctic is very criticized by Indigenous leaders within Alaska. There was a formal letter sent to NSF by for Indigenous groups around the Bering Sea about problems with navigating the Arctic.
Maybe we can go to some of the questions. We have, I think, another 5 minutes or more. If we have more, we can.
Yeah, and thank you. So I think we'll stay on a little longer, but if you need to go, feel free. And thanks for attending.
Thank you very much.
And like, you feel free to like unmute if you want to ask a question.
Right. Margaret Mate just asked, what about the polar research being done?
What do you mean by polar? Like current research?
No, it was I got somebody that notified me about being involved with that research, and I didn't really know anything about it, but they're doing some research in some of the remote communities in the Arctic. And um, I think it's mostly around gathering data about health and well-being. And I don't remember what the acronym stands for, but let me see if I can find it. I might have saved it.
So I can't really comment because I don't know anything about it. But I'm interested to learn more, and we can communicate off after the talk too.
Yeah, thanks. I just, you hate to get involved in something when you don't really know what it is
Yeah,
they're doing
same.
and whether it's been blessed or not.
All right, maybe we can answer one
Oh,
question.
Yuris, I definitely, if you want to add something.
Sure, I could jump on for a second. Hi, thanks for doing this. Yeah, I'm definitely listening and I appreciate it. So I'm getting my master's in Indigenous Studies. I have my bachelor's in English and both are at UAF. But there was a question about Indigenous intuition. I feel like this is where the assumption, there's a lot behind that. There's a lot of implications behind just saying Indigenous intuition. And so I was thinking this is where awareness comes into play as far as being taught of like a holistic sense of wellness. And this is like your positionality, aware of yourself and then your space. And then from there, this is where like observation and listening is fundamental to that awareness. And then so from that level of just being connected, then you get this just kind of this click of just seeing how things come together and the thought processes when you're observing a situation or a question, then it can be perceived more as intuition. But it's definitely being like attuned and like trained and thought within this like level of observation and awareness to where that's kind of just how you function more. And I feel like that's why it also seems more like intuitive. And I have this conflicting worldview with my husband. He's not Indigenous. And to me, a lot of things seem pretty obvious because my thought process is like, this is this because of this. Like, I see this whole collective scenarios of just what's going to work and based off of my observations, where he's not naturally inclined to look at things and see things like that. And that's a little personal insight, but
Yeah, thanks for adding. I feel like kind of straddling these two worldviews on my life, I don't necessarily notice things until it's like someone points it out or until I have a conflict, which I feel is like the same for you. And so it's kind of, I really enjoy those conversations of really understanding this. And that's kind of what I'm hoping to do for my research is fundamentally around this idea of self-reflection with self-reflecting with other people.
And so this is what I'm doing my master's in. And essentially, I'm studying myself and my positionality as a researcher and in my community. And it's really important. I'm really enjoying. I love that you put this together. And then also, I mean, we could talk about like resources and people that could help as you navigate this new discussion. I could definitely just, add some feedback.
Yeah, I would love that. Yeah, the website needs work. I'm going to add all the links I put today up on the website, and I definitely could use help in making sure that I'm also covering, because again, it's just kind of, I'm not aware of it until I hit a conflict around it.
Yeah. And this is like awesome because this is where it's like, we have an Indigenous Studies program, but obviously you get into the science programs at UAF. This is an example where there's just that like division of just what is it? I don't know. It's compartmentalized. So
it's very siloed. And that's kind of some of our goals longer term, is trying to think of ways to break it down through this. And so I know we talked about maybe just hosting more free-form discussions instead of a formal talk in some of these sessions. I don't know if that makes sense for people to build a sense of community.
Information to unpack, so I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So Margaret, we got more questions before the talk. Would you like to answer some of them, or should we refer them to future speakers?
I guess, what are they? Yeah, people are still on. So unless someone wants to ask a question in person, if you're here. No? Okay.
Yeah, we don't have any more in the chat right now.
Okay.
Hey, this is Glenna. I have a quick question for you, Margaret.
Yeah.
Hey, so you're going to talk again about the co-production later on in the series, yeah?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So I'm assuming that's probably when you'll address more about the co-creating knowledge and the differences between representation and some of those things that we've.
Yeah, and I think, well, we have some speakers that are not me gonna be speaking on that too. I figured this is more of the basic knowledge that I could cover and then really tap into the expertise of people who've been doing this work a lot longer than I am.
Sweet. Okay, cool. Well, really happy to have you hosting this series. So thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, Amy, have I thought about making my own Venn diagram? No?
Hi, it's Amy. I'm on the phone.
Oh, okay. But you're on the computer too.
Hi, Margaret. This is Amy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I am, but my internet's not that great to support the audio portion. So, yeah, I was thinking about because I'm a very visual person, I need to be able to see things, and I really love that you included Barnhart and Quaggley's Venn diagram over the different ideas. But because there's so many terms that you used to help others understand where things might sit on the overall, I guess, boundaries. I'm just thinking, have you thought about making your own Venn diagram to house it? Thanks.
Yeah, I'll think about it. So are there any other questions?
I don't see any other questions right now. Yes, just to say it again, we will post all of the resources Margaret shared on the website. So you can read up on them. And there were great ideas in the chat. We have the chat. We will get a copy of the chat. So I'll forward that to Margaret too. Yes. And yeah, for next week, Annie Mahoney will speak next week. All of you that have signed up for this week will send an email with a new Zoom link to all of you as an email. And the RSVP is mainly for people that haven't joined yet.
Or if you have questions too, if you want to submit formal question. Yeah, I mean, there's no. And we also have a Google Calendar for all of the TEK Talks. If you email us, we'll get you added to see that. So,
yeah. Great. So thanks everyone for joining.
Yeah.
Thanks Margaret for speaking today. And yeah, I think with that, I would think we would close the meeting.
Yep. I'll stop the recording.